We continue now at the top of Daf 80a Daf and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 80a. The Mishnah continues, Hanitonin b'matana achas. Let's say you have karbonos, which there would be one application of blood to the mizbeach, shenisarvu b'nitonin b'matana achas, which get mixed with other bloods that are just one application to the mizbeach. So then yinosnu b'matana achas. So then you just do one application to the mizbeach. Matan arba b'matan arba. Let's say you have the blood which is supposed to be four applications to the mizbeach gets mixed with other blood that's supposed to be four applications to the mizbeach. So then yinosnu b'matan arba. So then you're going to do four applications to the mizbeach. Rashi explains, Hanitanin b'matana achas. Again, if you have blood that's supposed to be one application, could go in, for example, dam bechor shenisarif b'dam meiser. Let's say you have the blood from bechor, it gets mixed with the blood from an animal that's meiser behema. Bein bebolol, bein bekosos. For this part of the Mishnah, it doesn't matter if all the blood actually gets mixed together in one vessel, or if they're just mixed up in the sense that one is in one cup and one is in another cup. We don't know which is which. So yinosnu b'matana achas. So then one application should be done. Rashi says, kasal right now we think damrinon yesh bila, that we say that there is mixing, and so therefore we can rely on the idea, let's say the bloods are mixed together, that when you do this application you're really doing it from both of them. Vim bekosos, now if they're in separate cups, yitain matana mizeh, so then you'll do one application from this cup and one application from the other cup. Matan arba, let's say you have blood that's supposed to be four applications to the mizbeach with other blood that's four applications to the mizbeach. Kimo dam ola b'dam shlomim, for example. Let's say you have the blood of an ola mixed with the blood of a shlomim, or b'dam osham, or with the blood of an osham. Sheshneim tunin shtei matano shein arba. Both of them require two applications, which are four. That means you apply it to two corners of the mizbeach, and it goes on four walls of the mizbeach. Ushneim tachtonim, and in this case they both belong to the lower part of the mizbeach. So again, in that case, you'll simply do the application. You'll do the four applications, as both of those bloods are mixed, have essentially the same kind of application. And the Mishnah continues, Matan arba b'matana achas. Let's say you have blood which is supposed to be four applications and it gets mixed with blood that's one application. What do you do in that situation? Rashi explains, Matan arba b'matan achas kagon dam ola b'bechor. Let's say you have the blood of ola with bechor, shein tachtonim, and these are both tachtonim, they're on the lower part of the mizbeach. So if you have a situation like that, what should you do? So here we have a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Eliezer says, Yinosnu b'matan arba, you should just do four applications. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Yinosnu b'matan achas, you should do one application according to Rabbi Yoshua. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer said to him, he said to Rabbi Yoshua, Harehu over al Baal Tigr, according to you, if you're just doing one, so isn't that a violation of Baal Tigr? You're doing less than you're supposed to do. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, so Rabbi Yoshua, he said to him, Rabbi Yoshua said back to Rabbi Eliezer, Harehu over al Baal Tosef, but according to the way you're doing it, you're doing four applications, so then it's Baal Tosef, it's a violation of Baal Tosef, you're adding on. The one that was supposed to just be one, you're doing four, that's a violation of Baal Tosef. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Lo nemer Baal Tosef ela kashu b'atzmo, it's only a violation of Baal Tosef if the blood would be by itself and you would do more than you're supposed to do. Here where it's a mixture, it's not a problem of Baal Tosef. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua said back to him the same response, Lo nemer Baal Tigra, ela kashu b'atzmo. We only say Baal Tigra, again, when the blood is by itself. And the Mishnah continues, V'yod Amar Rabbi Yoshua, further Rabbi Yoshua says, Kishenasata avarta al Baal Tosef v'yosisa masa b'yodecha. He says, when you do the application, so then, if you're going to do, let's say, the application like Rabbi Eliezer says, that what you should do is four applications, so then you're violating Baal Tosef, but plus you're doing an action, you're doing something. Keshalona sata, but when you follow what I say, when you don't apply, meaning you just do one application, so granted, avarta al Baal Tigra, granted that you transgress Baal Tigra of doing less, however, v'lo asisa ma'isa b'yodecha, but you haven't done an action, you haven't done something actively, the violation is passive, and therefore Rabbi Yoshua is arguing that his solution is preferred. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Eliezer says, Yinosnu b'matan arba, you should do four applications, v'roa ha-matanos ha-yeseros, and we can view the extra matanos for the one that's supposed to be hanitanos midam ha-bechor, for those that are being applied from the blood of the bechor, which is supposed to be just one, ki'ilu hein mayim, we'll view it as if it's just water. V'ein ze Baal Tosef, therefore this is not a violation of Baal Tosef, according to Rabbi Eliezer. And Rashi continues, b'matana achas, according to Rabbi Yoshua, you should do one application, mishum Baal Tosef, because we want to avoid Baal Tosef. V'yedei ola yotza, and still for the blood of the ola, which really should have been 4, now you're doing 1, but still 1 will be sufficient to fulfill the obligation to be yotzei. T'chol hanitanen al mizbeach achitzon shenesanan b'matan achas keeper, because the halacha is anytime there's application of blood to the outer mizbeach, if you do 1 application, it still is an atonement. It still is considered to be effective. And again, Rabbi Yoshua then argued, "V'lo asisa ma'isa b'yadecha." It's better that you do the solution again where there's a violation possibly of Baal Tigra, but at least that violation is not going to be active; it'll be passive. Ve'eno doma osa ma'isa. You can't compare actually doing something wrong. Liyoshe ve'eno osa, to a person who's just sitting and doesn't do something. V'isser b'me'elav, and the isser, the prohibition, that violation happens on its own. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, going on the first part of the Mishnah on the previous Amud, Lo hichsher Rabbi Eliezer only says kosher. That was talking about a scenario where you have kosos of blood that get mixed up, but then 1 is already offered. So Rabbi Eliezer says you can assume that the 1 that was offered was the disqualified one, and the rest can then be offered. And so now Rabbi Elazar is saying that Rabbi Eliezer only said that's allowed, ela shnayim, if you're going to offer 2 at a time, because if you offer 2 at a time, 2 cups of blood at a time, so you know for sure one of them is okay, so that's what allows it. Aval echad lo, but if you're going to do 1 at a time, then it would be problematic, because again, it's possible that that's the one that's disqualified, so that would be a problem. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Rav Dimi asks on this from the Mishnah itself. The Mishnah says, V'chachamim omrim, the Chachamim say, Afilu karvu kulon chutz me'achad, even if all of them were offered except for 1, chutz me'achad mehen, except for 1 of them, yishafech liyama, then it's poured down the drain of the Azora. And so presumably Rabbi Eliezer argues on that case of the Chachamim, and there's just 1 left. We're not talking about a pair. And the Gemara says, Amar le Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa. Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Sabra loch, I'm going to explain to you, my echad, what does it mean echad there at the end of the Mishnah? It doesn't mean just 1 left, it means a zug echad, it means that there's 1 pair that's left. And again, that was a similar answer that was given previously in the Gemara, and so that's what's going on in this Mishnah as well. And the Gemara continues and says, Utsricha, now it's necessary to have both of these Mishnayos. Rashi explains, Utsricha lefluge betarvayu. We need to have the machlokas here between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan in both cases, meaning Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan bebale mumin evarim be'evarim v'kosos bekosos. We have a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan when there's a mixing up of animals and some have blemishes. So we had a machlokas by limbs, when the limbs get mixed up in terms of offering the limbs. And then we had a machlokas also when the cups of blood get mixed up, and it seems to be an identical machlokas. And so the Gemara is saying it's necessary to have both of them. Again, with tzricha, it's necessary. The Yitzmar Baha, because if we only had this case, Baha Kamer Rabbi Eliezer, so Rabbi Eliezer would say it in this case. Rashi explains, the Yashminon be'evarim, if we just had it in a situation where the limbs get mixed up, Ba'i Kamer Rabbi Eliezer Yakrivu, that's where Rabbi Eliezer says, again, they can be offered, Mishum desavid kaparaso behechsher, because the kapara was done properly, meaning to say the kapara is really dependent upon the offering of the blood, and now you have the burning of the sacrificial portions, the burning of the evarim, so maybe over there we understand that Rabbi Eliezer is lenient. Again, as the Gemara says, Dietmar Baha Baha Kamer Rabbi Eliezer Mishum Des Avid Be Kaparaso. There the kapar is already finished. Aval Baha, but in this case, meaning in a situation of the blood, Rashi says, Aval Gabe Kosos Bekosos. When we're talking about a situation where the cups of blood get mixed up, the Iker Bekilkul Emalo, where the main part, meaning again the kapara, the actual application of the blood, is already ruined. So maybe Rabbi Eliezer would not be so lenient in such a situation. Again, that's why we needed to have the case of the blood as well. And the Gemara continues, V'iyitmar Baha. Now, if we only had this case, so the reverse, Baha Kamri Rabbanan, so that's where the Rabbanan would say the Rabbanan would be strict, meaning maybe only by the blood they would be strict, Aval Baha, but in the case of the limbs, Eimamodu L'Rebbe Eliezer, maybe we would say that they would admit to Rebbe Eliezer. So Tzricha, that's why it's necessary to teach both cases. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hassam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, this is a Mishnah Meseches Para, Tzlocha shenaflu l'socha mayim kolshu, if you have a flask containing the mechatos, that's the waters of purification used in the purification of Tumas Meis. So if you have that water and some other water fell in, what do you do in such a situation? We have a machlokas tanoim, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Yaza shtei hazos, you can do 2 sprinklings, and that will solve the problem. The Chachamim poslim, and the Chachamim say it's disqualified, there's no way to solve this issue. Rashi explains, Tzloches shel mechatos hamukdoshin. Again, you have a flask containing mechatos which are sanctified. Shenafal esocha mayim di al makolshu, a little water falls in. Rabbi Eliezer Omer yazeh shtei hazos. Rabbi Eliezer says just two sprinklings. Habola hazos mehen al atame. If you want to sprinkle on someone who's tame using that mechatos, yazeh shtayim, just do 2 sprinklings. V'taher, and that will create purity. That will be effective if it's done in that fashion. And the Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbanan. Now we understand the Rabbanan's position that it's disqualified. Savri Yesh Bila, they hold that there is mixture. All this water is now mixed together fully. V'hazah tzri chashir, and sprinkling needs a minimum amount. Ve'ein mitzdarfen lahazos, and you can't combine 2 sprinklings to get that minimum amount, and that's why you are stuck with a problem over here, and we say that it's disqualified. Rashi explains, Bishlam Rabbanan Savri Yesh Bila, we understand the Rabbanan say there's Bila, it's mixed. Kedetanan b'mas nisan, like we learned in the Mishnah, im lo nimlach, it says, let's say the person didn't ask what to do, v'nosan, and then he does apply it, kosher, it's kosher. Alma samchina na bila. So you see in general that there's a concept of bila, of mixing. V'yomer lach ha-misarif belach misar bekulo, meaning if you have liquid mixed with liquid, it's considered that it's completely mixed together. Ve'ein lach tipa mizeh shelo yehei ba mechavero. Every drop of water is going to have a full mix of everything. Shelo yehei ba mechavero ksas. You're not going to have any drop which won't have the other kind of drop mixed in, at least a little. V'hachanami, so we'll say the same thing over here. Nihidi yesh bila, granted again that there is bila. Again, our Mishnah indicated that there is bila when we're talking about the blood, and we're saying that's true over here. So granted that there is mixing. V'yesh b'chol hazah min hamayim haksherim, and every single sprinkling has some of the kosher water. But kasavri, but they hold hazah tzri chashir, they hold that sprinkling requires a minimum amount. Ve'ein kancher, you don't have that minimum amount. Shareyesh ba min haposelas, because you have here some of the disqualified water. Ve'imisham demazah shtei hazos, and if you'll say, well, you'll do 2 sprinklings, and so therefore that will give you the minimum shear. Kasavri and mitzdarfen osalamalos hashniya shear hachaser b'rishona. You can't have a second sprinkling combined with the first in order to get that minimum shear. That is going to be the opinion of the Rabbanan. But the Gemara continues and says, Ela Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that 2 sprinklings are effective here, so my kosavar, what exactly does Rabbi Eliezer hold? Kosavar ein bila, if he holds that it's not really mixing together, that it's not necessarily true that every drop of water you're going to take has water that's both kosher and puzzle mixed together. So kimaza shtei hazos mahavis, so even doing 2 sprinklings, how does that help? Dilma tarvayu maya kamazi, maybe both times he's just sprinkling the regular water. So ela kosavar yesh bila. So rather you have to say that Rabbi Eliezer also holds that there is mixing over here and every drop contains from both. But kosavar ein hazot tzri chashir. But still, if Rabbi Eliezer holds that sprinkling does not have a minimum amount required, so lama li shtei hazos, what do you need 2 sprinklings for? That wouldn't be necessary. Even 1 should be enough. So ela kosavar, rather must be holds hazot tzri chashir, that the sprinkling does require a minimum amount. But kosavar ein mitzdarfen lahazos. But let's say he holds that you can't combine the 2 sprinklings for that minimum shear. Ki mazer shtei hazos mahavis, so doing 2 sprinklings, how does that help? V'inami mitzdarfen lahazos. And even if he holds that you could combine the 2 sprinklings, let's say that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds, but mi yemar demoli le shiura, who says that you really still have enough of the shear, you still really do not know. Rashi explains Rabbi Eliezer, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, that he says 1 sprinkling is no good, but 2 are. So my kosavar, what exactly does he hold? Kosavar ein bila, if he holds there's no mixing. Ein somach al kach, you can't rely on the fact that it's all mixed up. Maybe it's not totally mixed. So kimaza shtei hazos, so doing shtei hazos, 2 sprinklings won't help. Ela kosavar yesh bila, rather he holds that there is mixing. We can rely on the fact that it got mixed. But mi yemar demoli le shiura, but then the Gemara said still, even if you're going to do 2 sprinklings, who says that's enough? Shema rov shtehen min hashuvin, you don't know how much is in each drop. Maybe most of each one of them maybe is from the drawn water, from the water that's not mechados. Vein b'shtehen kedei hazak sheira. Maybe you don't have enough combining in both to be a hazak sheira, to be a kosher sprinkling. And so that's the question of the Gemara on Rabbi Eliezer. And the Gemara continues, Amar Reish Lakish says, Liolam yesh bila, really holds there is mixing. V'hazot tzri chashir, and there is a minimum requirement of the amount of water for the sprinkling. V'hacha b'may askinan, but here what is the case? Kegon shenesarvu achas biachas. It got mixed with a 1-to-1 ratio, and therefore you are able to rely on the 2 sprinklings. And Rashi explains, Amar Reish Lakish Liolam Kasavar Yesh Bila, he holds there is mixing, Kiddushamina Lev Masnisin, like we see in the Mishnah, V'haide Boi Tarti Mishum Dehazot Tzricha Shir, and the reason why you need two is because there is a minimum shir required, Umitztarif Lazos, and you can combine the two, Udekasha Miyemer Demoli Shiura, and the question is, who says that it's really sufficient amount, that meets the minimum requirement? Hacha B'mayaskinan Kagon Shenesarvu Achas B'achas, it got mixed at a ratio of 1 to 1. Shir Hazah Mizu, V'shir Hazah Mizu. In other words, there was enough of a shir hazah from this one and this one, v'nisarvu, and then they got mixed. Hilkach ki mazeh shtei hazos. Therefore, when you do two sprinklings, so let's say it's 50-50 from each one, it's going to be enough. Al karchach mali leishiura. You certainly will have done enough. Sharei lo hayu min hapsulin kan ela kadei hazah achas, because the most you had from the disqualified was one hazah. V'hu hiz a shtayim, and he did two sprinklings. He certainly did enough. Biachas lav dafka. Now Rashi notes it doesn't have to be exactly a 1-to-1 ratio. Lav dafka nakat. We're not specifically saying it must be that. Dim hayu min haksherim harbe. Let's say you had a lot of kosher mechatas. Kol shagain de kosher. Then certainly would be good. Ki mazah shtei hazos when you're doing two sprinklings. To tufayna de ksherim mehechitesu lemifsal. Who says that if you're going to have again that extra amount of kosher, why should we say disqualified? Ela mishum psulin nakat law. The reason why we said 1-to-1 is in terms of the amount of the disqualified water. V'yesh bila garas b'de Reish Lakish, and in terms of Reish Lakish's approach over here, we're assuming there is mixing. Tekeva d'yamar hazat tzricha shir, because if Reish Lakish says you need a minimum amount, my dochke lameimar del Rabbi Eliezer ein bila, what would you say that according to Rabbi Eliezer there's no mixing, lakshuye masnisan Allah, that then we're going to have a question from the Mishnah, ulukme masnisan b'shenuya dechika kedel kamon, then we're going to have to say that our Mishnah, we're going to have to use answers that are forced. So within Reish Lakish, it's better to again understand that yesh bila, that there is mixing. And the Gemara continues, Rava Amar, Rava says, Liolam yesh bila, really again, there is mixing, v'hazah ein tzricha shir, but according to Rava, there is no minimum amount required for the sprinkling, and so then the question is, why do you even need two sprinklings? Just one should be sufficient, according to Rabbi Eliezer, and the Gemara says to that, Uknasa de kansu Rabbanan. According to Rava's approach, within Rabbi Eliezer, this is a fine imposed by the Rabbanan, ki echi de lo mishtarish le, in order that he shouldn't benefit by just being able to do one sprinkling in this situation. Rashi explains, Rav Amar Liolam yesh bila v'hazah ein tzricha shir, ushtei hazos tekamar lav l'malu yeshira. The fact that he says you need two sprinklings is not to have enough for the minimum shir. Elakanasu is just a fine. Delo nishtarish lo yistaker means he shouldn't profit benefila zu because this water fell in laharbos meimov b'mayim psulin. Now he's got more water with this mayim psulin, with this disqualified water. We don't want him to benefit in that fashion, and so we require a second sprinkling. And the Gemara continues with another approach. Rav Ashi says, Ein bila, there really is no mixing, and Yazah shtei hazos, and that's why he has to sprinkle two sprinklings. And Rashi explains, Rav Ashi Amar Hagirsa Hazu Meshubeshes B'Svarim. Rashi says the text over here is mixed up in these Svarim. It's mixed up in the Gemara. Venira Be'enai, it appears to me, Tehachi Garsin, and the proper text is as follows. Rav Ashi Amar Mayim Kolshu Tanan. Rav Ashi says any amount of water is what's said in the Mishnah. Ve'ein bilan, there's no mixing. Yazah shtei hazos, and do two sprinklings. Usviru leila Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi holds as follows. Hazah ein tzricha shir kerava. There's no minimum amount required for hazah, like Rava says. Umiu knasa lesle, but there's no fine imposed either. Hilkach, therefore, ihavis really yesh bila. Let's say he held that there is mixing, that every single drop contains at least some of the kosher mechatas. So bechada havasagile. So really one sprinkling would be enough. Ushtei hazos Rabbi Eliezer, and so therefore, what is the reason why you need two hazos, two sprinklings, according to Rabbi Eliezer? Mishum tekasavar ein bilitz, because he holds there's no mixing. Hilkach, therefore, if he's just going to sprinkle one, shema ein kan min aksherim klum, so you don't know what he sprinkled from. Maybe there's nothing from the kosher mechatos. Aval kimadi tarti, but if he sprinkles two, iefshar deleka bechada minayu min haksherim. It's impossible that at least one of them there must be some of the kosher mechatos. Do ein kan min hapsulin el kolshu, because the case over here is just a small amount of puzzle fell in there. So since just a small amount of puzzle fell in there, that's what it means again in the gears of Rashi. Rav Ashi Amar mayim kolshu. So therefore, if you do two times, you know again that you're going to have some of the kosher mechatos. V'hainu time de lo mashani belishna denesarvu achas biachas. Now, what's the reason why they don't answer in the same language we gave above to say that it's at a ratio of 1 to 1? Timkain have a mashma yesh shir lahazah. If you said 1 to 1, then it would sound like you're saying there is a minimum shear. V'yu ein hazah tzricha shir tzvirle. But he holds there is no minimum shear. Lachi dok lishna demasnisin dekatani kolshu. That's why it says a tiny amount of water fell in. De'ein lach behazos pchusa mikan. You don't have, it's impossible to have less than that amount in a sprinkling. Therefore, it would be impossible that doing both of these hazos would all be from disqualified water. Even if they're very small. Well, the common Mosavila Masnisin, and Rashi says, we will ask on this later on from the Mishnah. Again, our Mishnah on the previous Amud indicates yesh bila, that there is mixing, and so that is going to be a question on Rav Ashi's approach. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question on Reish Lakish's approach. Again, Reish Lakish said that hazot tzri chashir, there is a minimum amount required by hazah. We have a question from the following brisa. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, hazah kolshu metaheres, any amount of hazah purifies hazah. Ein tzri chashir, hazah does not require a minimum amount. Hazah mechsa kosher or mechsa pasul, hazah sprinkling half kosher and half pasul, it's going to be effective. And Rashi explains, L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer demachshir b'shtei hazos, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says it's kosher doing 2 sprinklings over here, hazah kolshu mitaheres, any hazah is going to purify. Deshema ein ba'achas mehen hazah brura, maybe one of them will not be a proper hazah. Shelo yehei ba min hapsul, and there shouldn't be among it from the disqualified water. We'll take a look at the Girson, the Shinuya Nuschos. The Girson, the Shinuya Nuschos says, mitaheres velo tema, don't say the time of dein echad mehen, that the reason is because you're not going to have in one of them min hapsulin. Ella svirale, don't say that that's the reason. It's not that the reason is because it's impossible to have among there from the disqualified water. Ella, rather, svirale dahazah kolshu metaheres. Rather, Rabbi Eliezer holds that any amount is going to purify. Dahazah ein tzri chashir, because hazah does not require a minimum amount. V'hazah mechsa kosher or mechsa pasul, and if you have a sprinkling half kosher, half pasul, v'lo tema hazah kolshu hidik sheirin. Don't say that any amount is kosher umiu lo yia ima taroves pasul, but it can't have within it, mixed within it, a mixture of pasul also. Ela afilo yeshba taroves pasul machshir, even if there is a mixture of pasul, it is still kosher. That's the proper explanation of Rabbi Eliezer. Elatimud Rabbi Eliezer de boitarti, the reason why Rabbi Eliezer requires 2 sprinklings, lav mishum tzirufu, it's not because we have to combine the 2 sprinklings together to get the minimum shear, because again, each one is going to have some pasul water. Let's sarfu l'kashir. That's not the reason. It's not because we're combining da'akatani ein sricha, because again, it says over here, Rabbi Eliezer holds it's not required to have a minimum shear. V'kasha l'Reish Lakish, and this is difficult according to Reish Lakish, who says that Rabbi Eliezer holds there is a minimum shear, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Pei Amud Beis.